Okay, you all well into reading He Is There and He Is Not Silent?
I've already read it.
Wonderful.
I finished last week.
Wonderful. Okay. And there's one person hiding back there.
I haven't even started yet. I don't have the book.
Okay. Well, I had another copy, so you should get.
I need to get my hands on it.
All right. Okay, Francis Schaeffer and True Truth. Schaeffer's legacy. Let's start there. The primary legacy is he introduced Christian thought back into the philosophical discussion at the academic level. So I think we talked a few weeks ago, or maybe it was actually in the last session, about how Christian theologians and Christian philosophers have basically exited the conversation at the academic level in the early 20th century, and so Schaeffer was instrumental in leading Christian thinkers back into the fray, and many people were influenced by that and followed in his steps.
Walker gave me.
Okay.
The rest is for your chairs.
Take a short break here while we clean up the floor from.
Dad does have a copy. Now you do too.
That one's mine, by the way. Give it back. Not right now. Later.
Okay, so again, many leaders in the areas of Christian philosophy and apologetics cite Schaeffer as a major influence in their own pursuit of these subjects at the academic level. And to a certain degree, he is that for me as well. I think several figures play that role, but particularly those who studied, 10, 15 years before I did, were a lot of them, including my primary mentor when I was doing philosophical studies, was heavily influenced by Schaeffer. But though many think of Schaeffer as a philosopher or an apologist, he thought of himself as a what? An evangelist. And so he's best known for his work at L'Abri, a place that was known for the gospel and was known as a man who genuinely cared for people. I listened to a lecture by Schaeffer in the last few weeks, and he made the comment that that at least 1,000 people professed belief, conversion through the conversations that they and the interaction they had at L'Abri. And then he added to that. He says, and that's a very conservative number. That's impressive. And so Schaeffer's method is he would listen. We talked about that earlier today, that one of the primary tasks of the apologist is to listen. And if we start arguing without listening, first we're not addressing the issue that the person might have. And secondly, I think they sense that we haven't taken the time to really understand what they're saying. And so his methodology was to take the roof off a person's belief, a person's worldview, and expose the hidden presuppositions, the inherent contradictions. Then he would share the gospel, which he considered to include the only plausible explanation for the world in which we live. We talked about point of contact a little earlier today. The point of contact for Schaeffer in an apologetic is basically inconsistency. Is the person who is not living the Christian worldview is the only true worldview. It's the only truth that makes sense of reality. And so the person that denies that, the person that denies God, Christ, etc., but has to live within the world that God has made for the purpose of bringing ones to himself, has to live in a degree of inconsistency. Either they live their life, either their beliefs are completely, have a complete lack of correspondence to the real world, in which case the issue is livability, or they have brought into their worldview true beliefs about the worldview, which then necessarily conflict with the false worldview that they have. So Schaeffer's methodology was to take the roof off the house of police, to ask questions, to listen, and then to point out those inconsistencies. Now, his most famous work, which that's basically the subject of what I want to talk about today, is what's termed as his trilogy. The God who is there, escaped from reason, and he is there and he is not silent. And for this class, we had to read He is there and He is not silent. So it's like two sections of what I want to talk about. The first section is covering the ground in the God who is there and escape from reason. And then the second section is sort of a summary of what's in He is there and He is not silent. So I will also be intertwining some of my own observations that are appropriate based on the analysis of his work by the academic community since the publication of those books. So what you're going to hear is, sometimes an altered view, in some cases even a corrected view, I think, of Schaeffer, but holding the basic nature of what he had to say. And why is that necessary? I think while Schaeffer's work has stood the test of time, and he can be considered both a pioneer in his field as well as a genius with respect to his overall analysis, there is a consensus basically among those who have studied him that he missed the mark on much of the detail. And it's we don't really fault. I mean, he was a pioneer in his field, and the scope of his research and the scope of what he had to say was very large. And he didn't have so much of the tradition to follow in that most philosophers have today. We can go and read what people had to say about the history of philosophical thought, and not much of that existed for Schaeffer. And he was influenced largely by Hans Rookmacher, and that was a great help for him. But these guys were laying new ground. And so I think it would be a little bit unreasonable from our perspective to hold them to a standard in the details of that work that we might hold a philosopher today, because we're working with so many advantages that they didn't have. But before I commence talking about his work, I do want to mention a couple of major flaws from my perspective that I would correct on Schaeffer's thinking. One has to do with Thomas Aquinas. Is that Schaeffer claimed that Aquinas gave the human intellect sort of a pass with respect to the fall. In other words, the will might be fallen, the human intellect is not. This, for Schaeffer, is the genesis of the eventual turn to naturalism and subsequent overconfidence in human reason. You'll notice I placed the genesis a little bit differently in the history that we went through yesterday. It was basically in the steps that Descartes and Bacon made in jettisoning the basis for their confidence in knowing the truth, being rooted in God's revelation. So in my reading of Aquinas and others' reading of Aquinas, Aquinas is pretty clear that the total man is fallen. and that the reasoning and intellect is affected by sin. So I found that when he writes directly on the subject, he acknowledges the effects of the fall on the mind. It may be that Aquinas's method moved men, but Aquinas did rely on reason, and I think he's one of the most organized, strenuous thinkers that we have. The Summa Theological is just massive and rigorously done. And I think that method may have moved men to later rely more heavily on autonomous reason. And I think this is a gradual trend that increases over time and reaches its full expression in Descartes and Bacon in the early 17th century. So, as in most cases, even though I think some historical revision is needed here, the main lines of Schaeffer's argument and the movements in history hold true. There was, in the general time frame, a shift in thinking and a shift to autonomous human reason. And whether it's rooted in Aquinas or not, we might differ on that, but in either case, culturally, it is there, and Schaeffer's right to point it out. So that's one. The second is more close to heart, is Schaeffer's interpretation of Kierkegaard. He has a very negative understanding of what Kierkegaard had to say. But again, Schaeffer should not bear too much of the blame here, because I think he is merely following the dominant interpretation of his day. Kierkegaard's work lay basically unread until Karl Barth brought it to the surface in the early 20th century. And it took a while for the academic community to understand exactly what Schaeffer was doing, and to understand when he made statements of irrationality through the pen of his pseudonyms, that it wasn't necessarily his own voice that was speaking. And so there was an interpretation of Kierkegaard which faulted him with jettisoning reason, adopting irrationality, and assuming that life in Christ was based on an irrational faith. Later in the 50s and culminating in the 60s, there's a major reinterpretation of Kierkegaard that happens, recognizing what he was actually doing through the various voices to which he was writing. And the dominant view, the majority view, and almost universal view among Kierkegaard scholars today is he's not a irrationalist, that he was actually promoting rational thinking. But his writings were, as we talked about before, a negative apologetic against the systems that he was critiquing. So his work is complex due to his usage of synonymous authorship, and it took a while for people to really sort out what he was saying. If you go to a philosophy class at a typical at a typical undergraduate college today, you'll be taught the older view that Schaeffer's writing about, because that still persists among in general philosophy. Those ideas still persist, but almost universally, if you encounter someone who has majored in a sense in Kierkegaard, and their philosophical studies has not been generally based or on another philosopher, they've studied Kierkegaard deeply, they hold a view that's more similar to mine than Schaeffer's. So again, I think that this does very little damage to Schaeffer's overall work, because the ideas that he attributes to Kierkegaard were indeed live ideas of the day that represented steps into non-reason. I get through it. I'm a Schaeffer fan too, right? So I get through reading him by mentally replacing all of his references to Kierkegaard to one or another of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous impersonations. That's who Schaeffer's really talking about here. So I will not mind if you are unable to do this, but please do not mind if I wince a bit when you do not. And there are more. Again, it's the scope of what Schaeffer's doing, and it's generally recognized now that there's quite a bit lacking in the details. But generally, what he's saying has been affirmed through subsequent study. So,
Bolus pointed out that Francis Schaeffer was more intent on the conversations he was having with people than sitting down and studying all the old philosophers. It doesn't matter if he wasn't an academic, so why would we go into this?
and that's an excellent point. And that's a difference between him and Clarke, for instance, and him and Van Til. Clarke and Van Til are academic scholars. Yeah, that's what they're doing with their vocation. Schaeffer's doing something very different with his vocation, and through that evangelism, he becomes famous, and then he makes a tremendous impact on academia through other people subsequent to his work. He also has a fairly large impact on the politics of the day during the 70s and the 80s. So what does he say? These thoughts are taken from those first two books in the trilogy. There's a line of despair that we've talked about. Ramsey called it a line of uncertainty. But the line of despair is a line that is crossed when there's a step into non-reason. So everything above the line represents it's a continuing commitment to reason, where a step below the line of despair is a step into non-reason. And in Europe, Schaeffer claims that this happened in the late 19th century. He lists 1890. He thinks this occurred. This is all generally speaking. Various aspects of culture are at different points. And so in the U.S., he says it occurred about 45 years later, and say 1935. So these are the dates that he sort of tagged when this step into despair, into non-reason occurs. And there's a progression of that. So not only with respect to the line of despair and the step into non-reason, but he thinks that thought, ideas, beliefs follow a progression generally, that ideas are talked about in the philosophical philosophy. So they talked about at the philosophical level, and then they are after that expressed in art, and then after that they are expressed in music, and then after that the ideas work themselves out in overall culture, and then only after that they then impact theology. The early theology tends to be the last thing that is affected by the new idea as an outworking of culture in general. And of course, everything doesn't follow this progression in the same way. But it was interesting during the prior summer, the session one that we have on art and culture, to see how this. We were actually asking questions and saying, how do we see this idea of philosophy work itself out in art, music, culture, and theology? And you did see delays, in timeline delays with respect to that.
Did each one of these things been impacted by philosophy independently and it just happens in that order? Or is music being impacted by art?
Yeah.
I don't see that. I see the philosophy of music, but I don't see it coming from contemporary art.
Yeah, I feel like art's kind of the weird one in that chain.
Mm-hmm.
We don't, I'm serious, going to art galleries and.
Well, art, music, and culture are all kind of the same category.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's probably that both of these are rooted in philosophy more than the other thing. But I think at least relatively recently, the artists view themselves more as communicators of new ideas. They see themselves more as prophets, as yeah. What do you,
So you would say that this order might change in certain cultures. It's not always the same.
yeah, and it might change for a particular idea.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we're saying is a general progression that would have differences among cultures or even among ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the point I was making is that it just seems to me thinking on the fly that painters, for instance, are more in tune in producing their ideas through their painting than musicians are through their music. And maybe because of that is that when the idea gets into the culture, in a sense, into the high culture in expressions of philosophy of art, and it takes some time to really take its hold in music.
An artist might consider himself a philosopher. A musician may consider himself an artist.
Sure.
The culture may consider itself a music.
I'm a musician.
Well, what pop culture is defined by what music you listen to.
Yeah, there's some influence there. So,
Actually, right now with art, you can see the postmodernism really clearly in our art right now.
yeah, you can.
It's disturbing.
And the jettisons of ideas of good and evil. No, unfortunately, when we did our trip to DC, is that we had to avoid much of what was in the Modern Art Museum, the Hirshhorn Museum, because it just wasn't fit to see.
You have to pay to get there.
No.
Thank goodness.
And our primary art instructor, Dr. Thomas, in doing her research for her lecture, said, unfortunately, I just had to leave out of my presentation much of what was produced in the last 30 years. Because she was updating her material from when she had developed, years ago, and she largely found out that she couldn't do an update because she couldn't show us what was there. So just the calling evil good and calling good evil has really reached the artistic community. So when we were in Washington, yeah, it was shocking. I went and previewed the Hirshhorn Museum prior to the students going there the next day, and it was both shocking and depressing. And is this really where our culture is and where our culture is headed? It's sad. Completely different perspective coming out of the National Gallery, where there's much in the National Gallery to engage that is positive, that is beautiful. We didn't find much of that in the Hirshhorn. So if the line of despair is a step into non-reason, where do you think Schaeffer, from the history of philosophers, which we've been talking about a little bit, where is that line of despair with regard to
Schaeffer's time?
Yeah. Well, on Schaeffer's analysis, which philosopher do you think you would pick out and say, this is the guy where we really made the step at least to the line and then subsequently below it?
Nietzsche? No, he's below.
Nietzsche would be below, yeah.
Hume.
Yeah, Hume's before. Hume's a skeptic, and he's got Hume.
Oh, you mean during his time period?
No. Who does Schaeffer identify historically?
Oh, okay.
Kant's the guy that I did identify, right? Because Kant built the wall, right? I see Kant as the big, the boogeyman, right? or the big step in that culture has and thinkers have followed later, because you can know the physical, you can't know the spiritual. For Schaeffer, it is it's Hegel. So why would he say so?
Well, because Hegel came up with the dialectic.
So this was the step from the universals, from the absolute, to the relative and the particulars. So that was the major historical step leading to despair, according to Schaeffer. And it makes sense on his analysis. I think he has a point to make. Although Kant, Hegel is in a sense struggling and to move beyond Kant. Kant has made a statement that the spiritual is unknowable, and Hegel is in a sense trying to recover that. So I want to go a step backward and point to Kant, but it's a minor difference. So with truth, or in Schaeffer's words, true truth always challenges the human idea with a fixed reference point. It is the antithesis that points us in the right direction. It's the fixed point that challenges our thesis, our understanding, and moves us in the right direction. It corrects us so that we might be challenged again, but always toward the unmoving, absolute center. That's the role that antithesis plays for Schaeffer. Again, that what's in play is this is our understanding thesis, and we're being challenged by the antithesis, which is truth, true truth. And that challenge to us should move us closer to the truth. Whereas we lose that fixed reference point of synthesis. So truth with a small t, autonomous human reason, replaces antithesis with synthesis. The human idea is not challenged by an absolute point, but a relative point, which constitutes a mere challenge. The result is not a move toward the antithesis, but the realization of a new idea, the synthesis. And then, of course, the synthesis represents a new thesis ready for a new challenge. So Schaeffer really sees it as the outworking of what I pointed to, that Descartes and Bacon, they went to autonomous human reason, but it wasn't apparent what they were doing at that time, because they were claiming certainty and they were working within a Christian worldview. So by the time we get to Hegel, Schaeffer's point is that now we see the implications of what was happened before come out and be stated explicitly. He says this opens the door for an increase in autonomous human reason. It opens the door for relativism due to many progressions not oriented toward a fixed point. It's the basis for the idea of progressivism in our society now. The synthesis always represents progress, so change is always good because it always represents progress. Tradition is not good because tradition points to the past and the present is always more informed and better than the past. So this leads to what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, that anything that is recent is good, anything that is back there in the past is bad. It needs to be new. And of course, the dialectic that Hegel defined was picked up by Karl Marx and became the basis for Marxism, which is an increasing force in our society today.
Incredible. This is a great idea. Works really well.
Yeah. Did I tell you about the signature line that my friend had back in Durham with his email? So I have a good friend back in Durham. I wish I could see him more. But he used to have a signature line on his email that said, "Trust me, it will really work this time." And every word was a hyperlink. Every word in that phrase was a hyperlink, which took you to a Wikipedia page for a failed system of communism. Okay.
Was he communist?
No,
No. Okay.
no, it was a joke. Yeah.
There's a Christian cult in New Zealand that is working very well in communism.
Are they?
Economically, they are.
Uh-huh.
Spiritually, they are. But
Okay.
they've been there since 60s or 70s, and they're thriving.
Uh-huh.
Really?
Yeah.
I'd be interested in hearing more about
What do you mean by
those.
Strider? What's the name?
Gloria Vale.
Gloria Vale?
Yeah.
I should know that.
Yeah. Yeah, y'all get together later.
After this.
So I'd be interested in knowing more about that, because typically when societies are lifted up as being good examples of socialism or communism, there's a reason why it hasn't imploded yet. It's still on a path to implosion. Sweden, for example, is often held up in that way. But I used to work for a Swedish company, and I've got more inside information there. And Sweden's not all that it's made out to be. Norway is often pointed to, but Norway has been able to basically support its socialism because it has a resource that everyone wants, and a very small population to provide with that resource. They have oil. So a lot of times there are reasons behind that why it appears to be thriving, but really can't long term or generally at least. So, but I don't know about that specific case. I haven't heard of that.
Consistent. If they do it consistently, it really can't work.
Right.
It's usually it's either inconsistent or it's usually if it's working, it's usually not really communist.
Right. Yeah. So you seen the picture that I put up earlier for Schaeffer's picture looks more like this. He's got earlier philosophy, and then he recognizes that Kant is a major player. Then Hegel follows from Kant, and then you can't see my eyes, but I'm wincing here. Kierkegaard throws out reason following Hegel, and from Kierkegaard comes two lines: secular, existential, dualism, and religious existentialism. Anybody know what a definition of existentialism is?
More value than
Yeah,
general.
sure, more value than the process of end. Philosophically, from an ontological point of view, is that for existentialists, existence precedes essence. Okay, so we are nothing. There's no image of God. There's nothing nothing that makes us valuable in the beginning, that anything that we might become comes through existence, right? So for the existentialist, existence precedes essence. Biblically speaking, essence precedes existence. We're made in the image of God. At the point at which our life begins, we have innate knowledge. We have faculty. We have a living soul. Right? We have all of those things at the point at which we begin to do anything. There's a major flip of these two ideas. Where does essence come from? Is essence rooted in God's creation, or is it rooted in what we make of ourselves through existence?
How can an existentialism be religious?
Karl Barth. Well, religion. I mean, Kierkegaard's going to be called a religious existentialist, but there's a difference here. Kierkegaard is talking about becoming a Christian, not becoming a being, right? And so his ideas sort of get picked up and applied by the existentialism as becoming in a being sense rather than becoming in a Christian sense. And remember, Kierkegaard talks about us being rooted transparently in the power that created us, that we live out what Christ works in us. So in a very remote sense, talking about sanctification here. It's through our life we become more like Christ, right? So it's becoming Christian rather than becoming being. The other thing, Kierkegaard is looked at as the father of existentialism, which I think is a fairly false label. But so the existentialism like Nietzsche.
Could you talk about Karl Barth a little bit more before you went there?
Yeah.
And what religious existentialism actually was in Schaeffer's estimation?
So anybody remember what Karl Barth's view of Scripture is? Is it the Word of God?
He didn't.
It becomes the Word of God. How does it become the Word of God?
By us interpreting it,
And living it out. Yeah, through our encounter with the Scripture, truth emerges from that. It's not inherent in the text itself. It takes that encounter. So you see the idea of becoming here. Truth is, in a sense, emergent. It's different than what we're going to talk about in a minute, but it has some similar concepts. So Barth's the guy that coming from Kierkegaard, and Barth's the guy that rediscovered Kierkegaard. So there's he's definitely influenced. I think in actually some good ways he's influenced by Kierkegaard. But Nietzsche takes some of Kierkegaard's ideas and removes God from the center of it all and recasts it from a human perspective and ends up in nihilism. And my comment there is that, well, if you take God out of the Scripture and replace it with something else, you've got a very false idea. Take any true idea and take the core of truth out of it and replace it with something else, you get a corruption of it. So I'm less willing to fault Kierkegaard for how Nietzsche corrupted his ideas than some other philosophers might do. So this is kind of Schaeffer's progression. This is definitely below the line because from Schaeffer's perspective, Kierkegaard has gone into irrationality. He's gone into non-reason, and that's what puts him below the line of despair. Hegel in Schaeffer's view as the last major philosopher above the line, although he influences thought to go below the line. Okay, so some other existentialists that we talked about, a secular existentialist would be Camus as well. We talked about him a few days ago. We're actually going to talk about Camus some more either tomorrow or on Thursday, probably tomorrow. Okay, so let's explore this line of despair a little bit more. So here's the big line here. Here's the line of despair. And he's got a few categories here that he's talking about. He's got above the line of despair, after there's a separation. There's the non rational Okay. So actually what I'm drawing here is a little bit different. After we step into, below the line of despair, Schaeffer talks about the things that are of grace and the things that are of nature. And the things of grace rightly are logical and are we can know God. We can know the spiritual. That's the truth. But after you go below the line of despair, what happens with respect to grace and nature and thought? Well, up here you end up with the non-rational and the non-logical. Everything related to the spiritual, to the realm of grace, as Schaeffer puts it, is looked at as irrational. Nature is the rational and the logical. This is where it starts. And then in the existential forms, we have up here is something called the final experience or first order experience. So for Camus, for instance, this would be when the man reaches his full expression of being a rebel against the world. That would be the first order experience because he can't live in the world because the man wants hope, the man wants something greater, but the world can't offer it. So he's a rebel against it. And then down here is only particulars. There's no absolutes. There's no meaning. And man is a machine. Okay. So the spiritual or the noumena is unknowable, and the physical or the phenomenal is it's the only thing that's known. So you can really see the Kantian line here is what's knowable is down here. It's the physical, the rational. The only right reason, the only logic that we have applies to the physical, but there's no meaning in it because it can't support the idea of meaning. Kant might have supported meaning, but by the time we get the culture ends up being below the line of despair, then there's no meaning. There's only particular. Man is only a machine. There's nothing about him that's higher. We want to talk about the spiritual, the realm of grace, as Schaeffer calls it. then we enter irrationality, some existential experience, and certainly we don't have any knowledge. So what happened between grace and nature? Schaeffer claims that there is a difference between the two. There is a line, but they're in a sense connected. They're connected to one another. That up here we've got God, the Creator. We've got heaven, heavenly things. We've got the unseen, the noumena, and it's telos in the world. We have all these things up here.
So
Telos.
when Schaeffer says in this book that if you make God morality an upstairs affair, it becomes unapplicable in practical life. This is what he's talking about.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you teaching us grace, nature, and interdependence?
What does that mean?
It's a Roman Catholic doctrine about such and such. I thought you would be the only one who got that.
Okay.
It was an attempt at a joke.
Well, this is in somewhat rooted in Aquinas, right? So that's probably the relationship that we're seeing here. Under here is the created, the earth, invisible things, reality, the created order. We already got the created man's body, for instance, etc. So this is before the line of despair. This category Schaeffer isn't necessarily claiming all of this is the way we should do it, but this is the way the world viewed it before the step in the line of despair. So what happens afterwards is we have the non-rational up here, non-rational, no logic, no personality, certainly no personal God, and only faith categories. Don't really have any meaning. Under the rational, God is dead. This is Nietzsche. And then we have the cosmos and man as machine. So you see, before the step in the line of despair, we can see a correlation here. There's a creator, there's the created, there's heaven, and there's earth. There's man's soul and man's body, which are both constitute man. There's rationality in both. Rationality is not listed because of the assumed rationality in both. Logic applies in both. There's personality in both. They transcend the categories. And in here, there's this is largely jettisoned. The only thing that this is naturalism, basically. God is dead, the cosmos, and man is machine. There's also a difference in the way that man is perceived. If we look at being, we have the infinite God is the source of all being. And then there's man. There's animal. There's plant. And then there's non-living things, machine. Where is the greatest chasm Where's the significant chasm? Before the step of line of despair, Schaeffer says that the significant chasm is here. Man is made in the image of God. So these two are closely related. Man can know God. Man can reason like God. Man has the creative gift that he creates as God creates. So these have a similarity. All of these are lacking. Yeah, there is a main difference between plant and machine, but all of them are distanced in the ways that I just talked about. All of these things are distanced from God. After the step in the line of despair, here is the great chasm. Man is an animal, no different, and so man, like all of these other things, has a separation, a distance from God. We're not made in the image of God. We're a machine. We can't know if there is anything like a God. We can't know him because the finite can't know the infinite. We have no capacity to know a personal being because we're not personal. And of course, ultimately, where all that leads is that, well, a denial of this. And everything is basically matter. Everything is nature. So faith is pitted against rationality under the line of despair. And what are the consequences of that? Now, first consequence, Schaeffer says, is there is no morality. There's no standard for morality. We only have is, and from is we cannot have ought. And that's contrasted with C.S. Lewis, basically on the human enigma. C.S. Lewis says, no, we have a sense of right and wrong. We do have an ought. We don't do what's right and wrong. And that tells us there's a problem. But we do have oughts. Below the line of despair, though, there is no such thing. All we have is. There's no basis for law. Nietzsche ended up that might is right. Think about our current political milieu. What's the basis for resolving conflict? Power struggle, right? That's what it is. That's what it is up at the abortion clinic. It's a power struggle. Can you put something, in between the speaker of truth and the clinic that can jump up and down and chant curses and things like that? So it's whoever has the power to bring out their beliefs. Who has the power to stack the court in the way that they want to stack the court? Because whoever can get their ideas onto the Supreme Court, that's who's going to make the rules for society. It's all a power. It's not who is right and who is wrong. And it's basically a jettison of all standards. Even the Constitution is jettisoned based on the preference of ideas of who the most powerful people can put on the court to set the law. And that's no basis for law other than power, which is where Nietzsche ended up when he said that God was dead. There's no answer to the problem of evil. So first, no morality. Second, no basis for law. There's no answer to the problem of evil. There's actually no complaint against evil, because evil is really only understood in the context of creation, fall, and redemption. There's no true gospel, so we end up with things like the social gospel, social justice, churches being, we believe in social justice with a heavy dose of Jesus thrown in, or liberation theology that we talked about yesterday. So what's the lesson of all this? This was sort of a survey of the first two books. What's the lesson of all this? Man cannot stand in nature independently and autonomously and maintain a coherent view of himself or God. So that's a direct quote from Schaeffer. Let me read that again. Man cannot stand in nature independently and autonomously and maintain a coherent view of himself or God. What did Descartes and Bacon attempt to do? They attempted to stand in nature independently and autonomously. And from that, the philosophers and eventually the culture flowing from that was unable to maintain a coherent view of himself or of God. It led to despair. Let's pause just briefly for questions there, and then we'll get into the book that we read. He is there and he is not silent. Anybody need a quick break, bathroom break?
Yeah.
Let's take a 5-minute break for a bathroom break, and then we'll reconvene. It's about 8 o'clock. That's basically a summary of the first 2 books, The God Who Is There and Escape from Reason. So what does he say in He Is There and He Is Not Silent? First of all, unless our epistemology is right, everything is going to be wrong. Okay? And whether our epistemology yields confidence in knowing anything at all hinges on God communicating with us. Thus, it is not merely that he is there, but that he is not silent. That is the difference maker. And, we've been kind of all over that point the last few weeks, is what confidence can we have outside of the fact that he has spoken. And earlier today, we talked about, sort of hitting on the fact that he's spoken multiple ways. Of course, there's been special revelation throughout history. We like to think of natural revelation, God expressing himself through the things he has made, being expressed throughout time and creation. The really special revelation has been there as well. God spoke to Adam in the garden and communicated with men in various ways in various times, and as Hebrews teaches us, culminating in the fuller revelation that he gave to the nation of Israel, and then even more full with respect to the gospel, the revelation that he gave through his Son when he came into the world. So all of this God speaking to his creatures. And then we also hit on the fact that not only has God spoken, endowed us the language to understand what he has spoken, but has also given us a helper. Yeah. And so we have a helper even to understand all these things in the spirit that he has given to us. And so we talked about a couple of weeks ago that our goal is not just to communicate to people that God is there. Even if we were able to convince them, just the fact that God is there is not effective for salvation. In fact, it's only in a sense enough to convict them. If they're wise enough to know their sin, then they know the implication of that against the holy God. So it's not just that he's there; it's the fact that he is not silent, and he has communicated to us the good news, the resolution for the separation between us and him. And he says that there's actually a philosophical necessity of God speaking. And there's 3 aspects of a philosophical necessity for God speaking. The first is ontological. The ontological necessity is there's a dilemma regarding the nature of man. He is finite, but he is also personal. There are only 3 possible explanations for how man is the way he is. First, the man has come to be out of nothing. Second, that man has come to be out of impersonality. And thirdly, that man has come to be out of, did I say personality before?
No.
Impersonality. Thirdly, that man has come to be out of personality. So we've come to be either out of nothing, or out of impersonality, or out of personality. Those are really, there's no fourth category. That covers all explanations. And the only thing that explains man being personal is that man has come to be out of personality. So there's an ontological necessity. This is actually a form of the transcendental argument. It's referred to as the kalam. It's a version of the transcendental argument of the kalam, cosmological or transcendental argument. So these are the only possibilities. The only thing that explains the personality of man is that he has come to be out of personality, out of a personal God. Schaeffer said this: man, beginning with himself, can define the philosophical problem of existence, but he cannot generate from himself the answer to the problem. The answer to the problem of existence is that an infinite, personal, triune God is there, and that the infinite, personal, triune God is not silent, that we know of him. So that's the first necessity, the ontological necessity. The second necessity is a moral or teleological necessity. This is the second dilemma regarding the nature of man. Man is noble, but he is also cruel. Very similar to C.S. Lewis's in Mere Christianity, saying that man, we know what is good, we have an idea of the good. The law is written on our heart, but we're cruel, we're evil, we don't do that. And so there's something broken about man. If we should do that which we know is good, but we don't. We do that we know is evil. So there was continuity. There's two options here. There is continuity in the ethical nature of man. In other words, man is normal, as he should be now. So that's one option, is we're normal now, we're as we should be. But if that's the answer, then we have no hope for redemption, in a sense. We have no hope for a resolution to the problem in which we live. The second option is that there is a discontinuity in the ethical nature of man. Man is not normal now. Man is abnormal. He is fallen. He is not as he should be now. So the biblical witness is that man's nature is abnormal. There was a space-time historic change in man that arose from the fall. Further, there's an answer to the problem of abnormality of man provided by his creator. Man exists within the context of a historical timeline of creation, fall, and redemption. So Schaeffer argues that only within this context, the idea of man existing abnormally, only within this context is the dilemma of man's nobility and cruelty understood. We can explain that man is now cruel without God being a bad God. There is a hope of a solution for this moral problem, which is not intrinsic to the mannishness of man, as Schaeffer puts it. On this basis, we can have adequate ground for fighting evil. We can have real morals, moral absolutes, for now God is absolutely good. Outside of that idea, it's difficult to understand a God that is good. In fact, it's difficult of understanding evil at all. There's a universal recognition of evil. I think probably Nietzsche understood evil even though he claimed that he did not. I think there's a universal understanding of evil, but there's no explanation of it outside of a standard of goodness. Evil, as Augustine described, is not a substance of itself. It is an absence of the good. So without the good, there can be no evil. And without the good, there can be no explanation for the current state of man, that man is cruel. Even the sinner understands that man is cruel. Even the atheist understands that man is cruel. So that's the moral, teleological necessity. Then he says that there's an epistemological necessity. That there's two possibilities in knowing. One, that you take the particulars and reason to the universals. Or the other is you take the universals and reason to the particulars. I'm sure you're all aware of the painting that contrasts Plato and Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
They're standing next to each other, and Plato is pointing up. You know, it's up there. It's the universals through which we know things. Aristotle is holding his hand, you know, above the earth, saying no, it's the created things, the particular things by which we know things. So the mode of knowing from particulars to universals is one where nature, this is Schaeffer's words, is one where nature has swallowed up grace. Remember the charts we had up earlier. Everything was disappearing up above the line. Nature has swallowed up grace. Only nature exists in the realm of reason. Faith is in the realm of non-reason. The result is a Kantian world where the epistemology of logical positivism rules. Logical positivism. I brought it in discussion. What is it? That's the idea that knowledge comes from naked, bare facts. That all knowledge can be objectively tested, and all knowledge claims must be disproved. We know that's false. We know that's false because knowledge evidently doesn't work that way. And I think multiple people have pointed that out. But we also know it's false because its criteria, all knowledge can be objectively tested, or all knowledge claims must be disprovable. Those criteria are neither testable or disprovable. So it fails on its own on its own system. Schaeffer rightly points out two other things. He says that he's basically speaking of scientism. That's another way we might refer to logical positivism. That logical positivism is impotent to give us morals, law, meaning, explanation of our existence. Hearing use of the transcendental argument there, that there's no basis for any of those within logical positivism. And then secondly, he says that logical positivism has been thoroughly discredited through the work of Michael Polanyi. Okay. So Schaeffer recognized what Polanyi had done with respect to knowing. And of course, just to recapture some of that, all knowing is personal and relational in nature. There are no naked, bare facts. All facts are interpreted through a framework or worldview. Even science does not work on the basis of what can be proved. It works on theories, explanation, plausibility. Even hypotheses arise primarily out of intuition and not out of experiment. An experiment only serves to validate or invalidate an idea. So the issue left by Polanyi is how we have any confidence that we can know truly. It explains the process, This is the Polanyian system. It explains the process, but it does not give us hope that our knowledge does in fact correspond to reality, or that there is an absolute reality to be known. Let me state that another way. As Polanyi has done a wonderful job of discrediting the Kantian wall, the faith in scientism as a source of knowledge, and giving us some basic ideas of how we understand things and how we know things. But what it hasn't done is given us any hope that the knowledge that we gain does actually correspond to reality, or that there is even an absolute reality to be known. So where does that come from? And that comes from the Christian worldview, that God has made the world. There is a real reality and true truth. I like that term. True truth. God has also made the man. He has made him with the ability to perceive correctly. And again, Kant, I think, got something right here with the categories of the mind and critique of pure reason. But Kant did not go far enough in grounding the mind and reality in a metaphysical base. God has also given the presuppositions through special revelation to understand the world around us and to gain knowledge. We don't have to go around testing all presuppositions and perhaps dying in the process to get the beginning of a knowledge base in order to make sense of the world. Otherwise, so we don't have to wade in a sea of possibilities. God is not only there, he has spoken. And the Christian worldview also adds to the explanatory power of Polanyi's triad. First, it explains the debasement of the mind based in rebellion against God and truth. And it also explains the transformation of the mind that can be found in being in Christ. And thus for Schaeffer, it was the dual facts that God is there and he is not silent, which gives man the hope of knowing true truth. All right. And that's basically the summary. Just summarize, giving a summa to the summa, okay, is that there were three philosophical necessities. First, the ontological necessity, that man's personality has to be rooted in personality. The moral or theological necessity, that the Christian story of creation, fall, and redemption is the only explanation that really does justice to the question of evil and our lack of doing good. And that there's an epistemological necessity. It's the only way that we can actually have confidence in knowing anything at all, is that God has revealed himself to us. All right. Any questions? He is there and he is not silent. It's a good book. Nope.
No, I don't have any questions. A lot of my stuff about Schaeffer was answered when we studied Clark.
Yeah.
And Bonson, because they're more in depth. Because
Okay.
originally I liked his idea, but I didn't think he went far enough, like we were talking about with knowledge and things into the specifics. So I saw how you could question that, say like, well, how do presuppositions work? What was the specific one? Yeah, why not? Why not just live in an unreasonable manner? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that, Bonson and Clark deal with that more thoroughly.
Sure. Yep. All right. Well, one of the questions that you should allow to run around your mind for a little bit for discussion, possibly tomorrow, is what is the implications of all this to a person who is born and lives in a society without the truth? What is needed for that person to come to an understanding of the truth? So that's one question I want to explore over the next couple of days. And we'll also explore a bit in more depth some of the secular existential thoughts that flow post Kierkegaard and actually post Nietzsche, because I think some of them are extremely relevant to understanding how people think today. So we'll spend some time talking about that as well. Yes. Oh, will Camus himself make an appearance? How many people would like to actually have Camus visit
I'd like
on Thursday?
I'd like
Huh? I have a special in. I might can get him to show up, so we'll see.
especially again. I want character guys to show up. But Camus would be fun.
Uh-huh.
I'd like to study Camus' philosophy, but I guess I've kind of had my fill of the devil's advocate, honestly.
Okay.
Like my early philosophical training, that's all it was. Devil's advocate. Charles pretending to hold a position that he did not hold.
Oh.
Yeah, he had me really convinced sometimes. He was really good at it. You should see his atheism. It's impressive.
All right. Well, we'll call it a day, and we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock tomorrow.
Oh, come on, Cobra.